everybody. We are here today with IAA, and I'm already messing up the webinar slides. But hope everyone's having a great day today. And we are here today with IAA. We're talking about the hurricane and natural disaster outlook today. Environmental disasters, they're a really big thing with our industry, and I think a lot of people don't realize that at this moment. So I think that we really need to, well, I don't think, I know, we need to really discuss this in depth. So IAA and Blair Earl, as well as Dr. Phil, who we have here from the University of Colorado, they're going to give us a lot of information about what happens on the day-to-day and what's in store for the rest of the year. But let's just start right now with introducing our speakers. Today, well, first of all, I'm Allison Rogers. I'm the editor of Collision Repair Magazine and the host of these webinars, as you guys all know if you've watched these webinars before. And we've got Blair Earl and Phil Klotzbach here today. So why don't you guys introduce yourself? Let's start with Blair.
Hey, thanks, Allison. Blair Earl. I'm the managing director of IAA in Canada and part of a great team that is heavily involved in catastrophe preparedness and responsiveness across the country. And we've been dealing with catastrophes in this great country of ours for over 40 years. So good to be joined from people coast to coast. And you'll hear Phil a little later. But our thoughts and prayers and for some rain in Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan are going out to everybody today. So hope everything turns out well over the next 4 or 5 days. Back to you, Allison.
Phil?
Hi, I'm Phil Klotzbach. As it says in the Zoom thing, I'm a senior research scientist in the Department of Atmospheric Science at Colorado State University. So basically, the primary focus of my research is hurricanes. So our group is probably best known for the seasonal hurricane forecasts that we've been doing at Colorado State. This is actually year number 42 that our group has done these, all the way since 1984. If you look at me, I was not involved in the first one, but I've been involved for 25 of them now. So I've been involved in this business for a little while. Happy to talk with you today about the outlook for the upcoming season, as well as discussing some of the meteorology with the current Canadian wildfire situation.
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah, I'm very excited to hear what you have to say. I know in our pre-talks, I learned a lot. So I'm very excited to see what Phil has to say and what everyone learns from it, but also what Blair has to say. So let's start with Blair's stuff. Let me just pop this up here. All right. Okay, Blair, off to you.
Hey, thank you, Allison, and thank you, everybody, and good afternoon, good morning from coast to coast for who everybody is joining and giving us your valuable time. It's a very relevant and interesting topic. I'm going to start off by doing a little recap on 2024 and what went on in the country and a historical look back. And then my good friend, Dr. Phil, is going to take us into some of the education of why and how it happens and what the outlook is for 2025. So in 2024, we had the biggest year of catastrophe losses in the history in Canada. And one thing you'll notice, both the frequency and severity has increased in the last couple of years. The big events that happened last year were the Calgary hailstorm, the Jasper fire, the remnants of the hurricane that came up from the U.S., Debbie, that both hit Ontario and Quebec and led to the Montreal flooding that turned into two major events. So, our teams were tasked with servicing all of those. And one thing that we've done over the past 40 years is become prepared for the season to start starting in June. We've started a little bit earlier this year. We had a couple of fire warnings a couple of weeks ago, but we've unfortunately had great training over the past 5 to 6 years, starting with the 2016 Fort Mac fire and the 2020 hailstorm in Calgary, which were both significant events. This is a great market report by Aon, which recapped the last couple of years, but the devastation of the Calgary hailstorm, and I got to witness it in 2020, unfortunately, and it was like a giant bear claw came down across people's homes and their vehicles. And last year was devastating. 3.25 billion dollars in Calgary, and the processing of that storm and those vehicles went on all through the fall and winter, and it's just wrapping up right now. At the same time that the Calgary hailstorm started, our teams had to pivot and come back across the country to service the rapidly developing flood from Debbie, especially in the Montreal area. And if you can recount there from 2020 on, it recounts each of the storms and each of the different weather events, which Phil will touch on a little bit later. Thank you.
Yeah. I just want to ask a question here, Blair. Like, obviously, we'll get to what happens this year when we go through the predictions and everything. But like, what did that mean to you to look at that kind of information and just see what happened in Jasper specifically?
Well, I got to shout out to our operations team, because as a result of what happened all the way back in Slave Lake in 2011, we are now prepared 12 months of the year for this. It's so important for our insurance partners. But as we get into Jasper, I think, it's not just a statistic and a graph on a page, and it becomes the community and the Canadian people which are affected. And some of the pictures in the Rocky Mountains that happened in Jasper, it's heartbreaking to see, historic buildings and people's homes totally destroyed, and without being able to shut it down. It happened so fast.
Absolutely. Just
Yeah.
wanted to ask you that question. Sorry, keep going.
So just to wrap it up, I think one thing that, Phil's going to touch on, and we have to be prepared for all types of catastrophe events, and our preparedness is extremely important. Thank you. I'll go to the next one, Allison. So this is exactly what I'm talking about. Our teams pivoted into Jasper and service the community, and were asked to go out and identify vehicles, not just by our insurance clients, but all vehicles that were in the community. The homes on some of the streets were completely gone. There was no identification markings. So we had to do the best of our ability and take a ton of pictures with our technology and feed it back into the system. And as you'll see in a minute, it really helped the community and the people of Jasper get cleaned up and identify which vehicle belonged to who. And it led to a speedier processing efforts to be able to get the community back on its feet.
I think everyone should take a minute and look at this. Like, look at the grill there. It almost looks like it's a charcoal burner. Like, It's really devastating stuff. So props to IAA, and my thoughts go out to everyone who had to deal with this. It's terrible.
So this is a very proud moment for the people of IAA. And over 40 years, we've had people that have worked here 35, 30, 33 years. And it just speaks to how we jump in and help the communities. And it's a very proud moment for all of us in the company. We were recognized for our ability to service the business and service those people in the community and help them get back on their feet. And the note here, the city of municipality of Jasper talks about our disaster response and how an event should be handled. So that's how we approach it. And unfortunately, it looks like the severity and frequency are going to continue in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to know the like you mentioned, Blair, the level of care you guys take and the personability that you guys take with every single customer that you deal with.
Definitely. Thank you.
All right, next.
So how do we service that business? We're very lucky that we have 31 locations as a result of being part of RB Global. We joined Ritchie Brothers in 2023, and our 16 locations, their 15 locations, service the business. And one of the most important things of the 4 pivot points is real estate capacity. And we've added in extra partners to be prepared for the areas that keep popping up year after year. The other piece is operational execution. Our CAT trained team members go through continuous training to be ready as the season starts in the following year. And then a big shout out to our transportation partners. It's another area where we excel. We forecast where the demand's going to be and reach out to those partners to be ready in those areas. And probably the best examples last year were in the hailstorm in Calgary and in the floods in Montreal and southwestern Ontario and downtown Toronto. And then the big thing that helps us is our system is able to service the business from across the country and help out areas that are affected. Our Canadian Centralized Service Center is able to do that, and we're able to use the time zones to be able to service the business and continue to keep things moving. And if you scan that code, you'll get more information on our response strategy, which we published last year in June. So
if anyone wants that link, then just reach out to me, reach out to Blair. My email is allison@mediamatters.ca. Blair is blair.earl. Is it B dot
B or
at IAAI .com. So just reach out, but you can always reach out to me and I'll get you Blair's email. But there's lots of strategies all across the country to be able to deal with this kind of thing. And like we might be dealing with more as we'll talk to Dr. Phil about. And here we go to Dr. Phil.
And over to you, Phil.
All right, well, thanks so much. And yeah, so I'm going to now share my screen. Thank you so much for having me today. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Canadian wildfires. Unfortunately, the situation has really escalated there over the last, since I put together some of these slides about a week ago. And then we're going to spend the bulk of the time talking about the outlook for the 2025 Atlantic hurricane season, because that's the primary focus of the research that I do at Colorado State University. And just feel free, if you have questions over the course of the webinar, just feel free to drop them in the Q&A and we'll answer them as we go along, because no one wants to hear me just ramble on for the next 4 hours. No, just kidding, not that long, I promise. So when it comes to the wildfires in general, we have this fire behavior triangle. And so here we're going to primarily focus on the weather component, because that's what I do for a living, a little bit on the fuel component, because the fuel component is related quite closely to more to the climate than the weather. Obviously, if you've had dry conditions for several months and it's been hot, your soil moisture is going to be reduced. Obviously, alternatively, if it's been wet and it's been cool, you're going to have generally more moisture in the soil. So talk a little bit about what we currently have for setup in over Canada. And so it was generally a warm start to the year across northern Canada. This is looking at January through late May, so kind of the last basically 5.5 months. But really what I think has been really driving things is more lately it's been very warm. And if we look at some of these indices of basically wet versus dry conditions, you see kind of where the problem is, right? You see places like Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, a lot of red. It's been very dry. We basically tended to have low pressure along near the Aleutians and along the west coast of Canada. And unfortunately, downstream from that, we've had generally high pressure. High pressure is generally associated with drier conditions. It's generally been warm, dry, and that has not been good in terms of kind of the setup for wildfire season. We generally have dry conditions across, again, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. So there's some nice products that the Canadian Wildland Fire Information System has. So this is basically a fire weather index, and this is effectively what we see today. So the fire weather index is a combination of both, basically kind of like pre-existing conditions, so kind of what the soil moisture, what the fuels are like now, combined with weather. So if everything's super dry, but you have a massive amount of rain coming in, the fire weather index is going to be a lot lower than if everything is dry and it's everything. If the soil is dry and you still have and you have warm and dry conditions, you can see for right now that we have very high fire weather indices over most of Alberta, pretty much all of Saskatchewan, the lower 2/3 of Manitoba, extending into Western Ontario and portions of Quebec. But really here, we're going to focus on Western Canada because obviously that's where the challenges have been and continue to be. I also should mention up into the southern part of the Northwest Territory. So the nice thing with this, Blair has his hand raised. So feel
Hey,
free, Blair, yes, what is the question?
hey, Phil, Weather Geek.
Yes.
We're going to have 5 to 7 days in Alberta of some precipitation. How much will that knock down that red zone? How much rain do you need to get to be able to make an adjustment to that map?
This is a perfect segue to the next slide, which is actually going to show the forecast of this fire weather index for the next 10 days. So this is a really nice product because in addition to kind of having like, here's what it's like now, it takes into account modeled forecasts of precipitation. This should be looping. All right, hang on. We're gonna go back.
I think just as
Okay, now it's looping.
Sorry, not to interrupt to you guys, but I know we all saw the news as of last night that Manitoba is now dealing with an emergency situation with their fires. So prayers go out to them, and hopefully that resolves soon. But
Yes, that's correct. So the whole province is under a state of emergency. I saw there were 17,000 people that were under mandatory evacuations
yeah.
as of this morning. So if we look at kind of where the colors change, I mean, there's good news, right? Especially Alberta, you do see that even by the end of May, there is a significant reduction because they should get some fairly healthy rain in Alberta. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like much of that rain is going to get into Saskatchewan and Manitoba. I just looked, for example, at the Environment Canada forecast for Flin Flon, which is one of the cities that's under mandatory evacuation, basically is sunny and dry for the next 5 to 7 days. So unfortunately, I think Alberta is going to see some relief. I think a little farther to the east, no relief, at least in the immediate future. Unfortunately, from a weather climate prediction perspective, my focus is a lot on tropical weather, which has a lot more predictability. So we can kind of forecast stuff, 1-2 weeks in advance, or sorry, even 1 to 2 months in advance with some skill. Mid latitudes, weather changes very quickly day after day after day. And we unfortunately, don't have a lot of predictability beyond that point. And so the next slide, this is showing forecasts from a weather model. This is the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecast. And this is a prediction of temperature over the next 2 weeks. And so you can see basically this is a 5-day average. So the changes are fairly slow to show, but it kind of shows that broadly we're going to have, unfortunately, fairly similar set of conditions. You'll see some cooling over Alberta associated with enhanced precipitation, but primarily over Saskatchewan and Manitoba, unfortunately, still staying warmer than normal. The high pressure is going to be hard to shake, at least it looks like in the short term. We generally have kind of basically a persistent weather pattern of kind of cool and wet in the far western part of Canada, and then ridging or high pressure downstream. And if we look at the next slide, so this is from the same model, but forecasts of precipitation. And this is basically what the model is forecasting for the next 2 weeks. And so this is the aggregate precipitation total. And you can see, Alberta looks like eventually will be a little bit on the dry side, some relief in the short term. But if we look farther to the east, Manitoba and Saskatchewan, unfortunately, generally staying fairly dry there. So we don't have any. Unfortunately can't say great news. We're going to see a ton of rain, next week or something like that. Now, obviously, models aren't perfect. Maybe things will change, but right now, unfortunately, this is kind of not a great, at least in the short-term future, doesn't look particularly good for these fires. I don't think there's going to be any major relief on the way. At least when I checked this morning, at least the winds in places like Flin Flon weren't particularly strong, which is good news. We don't have like massively strong winds. So in Colorado, we obviously get wildfires here. In Colorado, a fair amount, and those can be very, very fast spreading because we can get some crazy strong winds off of our mountains where you get winds 80, 100 kilometers an hour, and that can obviously cause massive fire spread very quickly. So wind's another big factor in addition to both the precipitation and the temperature in these wildfire setups.
Yeah, Phil, could you just take a quick second to describe the colors to people? Because I think some of them might not be as familiar with the colors as you might be.
Yeah, so here what we're looking at is precipitation. Anomalies mean differences from average. So anything in green, as you might guess, would be more precipitation than normal. Anything in brown is less precipitation than normal. So if we look, you just kind of eyeball Alberta, especially but Manitoba and Saskatchewan, it's a lot more brown than green, so generally just drier than normal.
Yeah.
So that's
Okay.
kind of what we're, again, these models aren't perfect. Maybe things will change, but at least in the short to medium term, it doesn't look like any major changes coming. At least no massive signs of relief coming in the short term there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That's good.
Sure. So this next image is the Canadian Drought Monitor. So this is updated once a month. We have a very similar product in the United States as well. But these drought monitors basically are looking at kind of longer term timescale things. So as you might guess, darker oranges and reds indicate more severe drought. So you can see kind of where a lot of these fires are areas that were under significant drought. Now this only updates once a month. The last update to this was May 8th. So the drought conditions likely have worsened somewhat in Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. Since that time, you also see elevated drought in the far eastern part of British Columbia up into the southern part of the Northwest Territory. So this is usually a good place to start if you're looking at areas that may have fire risk, if other conditions are conducive as areas that are in drought. Obviously, you can get fires anywhere, but if it's been pretty wet, obviously the odds of fires go down quite substantially. So when I initially put the slide deck together last week, there were just a handful of dots. So these are wildfire hotspots. So basically what this is basically where satellites are measuring basically temperatures warmer than they should, which is indicative of fire activity. And obviously you can see, again, the areas that we've been talking about, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, really elevated fire hotspots at this point. Some in Alberta, a few up in Northeast British Columbia as well. So obviously that is concerning, and obviously you see a whole lot of clustered of dots, kind of the areas that are under mandatory evacuation at this point. And so, this is a nice kind of, I would recommend, obviously this slide deck's going to be available after. Some of these links I think I found super helpful for kind of gauging the wildfire risk, both current and forecast. So this Canadian Wildland Fire Information System has a wealth of good resources for monitoring Canadian wildfire risk. So to kind of get to a little bit of what Blair just talked about as well, if we look at wildfire and you look at basically the hectares burned per year going back to 59, if you go back in time, like there's not really, I can't really necessarily see like there's a massive trend, especially since about 1980. It's pretty much a flat line, but then you have this huge anomaly in 2023 where you obviously had just a tremendous amount of acreage burned. And I can tell you from being in Colorado downstream, we had a lot of smoke from the Canadian wildfires and obviously shifted a little more towards the Midwest later, but obviously a tremendous amount of fires that year. When it comes to damage from fires, obviously, kind of like with hurricanes, let's talk about later, it's all about location, location, location. Obviously, if you're burning a ton, but it's an area where not many people live, obviously the damage from those fires can be fairly small, whereas obviously a small fire impacting a densely populated area can cause tremendous amounts of damage. If we look at the damage caused by wildfires, going back to 1990, I'm just kind of in a couple, obviously the Fort McMurray one, from an economic loss perspective was the largest wildfire from an economic loss perspective, about $6 billion in damage. And then obviously we saw what obviously already talked about, the Jasper fire last year. One thing I think is interesting is, so coming from the United States, we're at about 90% of our wildfires are human caused, whether that be anything from power companies to we've had everything from improperly wired hot tubs cause a really big bad wildfire in California, to a lot of times power grid issues with transformers and things along those lines, to just arson effectively, or just basically campfires that aren't being put out. Whereas in Canada, it's about half. A lot of the ones in Canada are ignited by lightning. So just to kind of, it's interesting to see how the differences are between the US and Canada from that perspective. Obviously, if you can have conditions super conducive for a wildfire, but if you don't have that ignition source, you're not going to get the fire. And there's definitely been days where you'll see conditions are all right, but thankfully it's just not the ignition sources. But obviously in Canada, a lot of them are caused still by lightning. But again, obviously 50% aren't. So they're human caused, whether deliberately or accidental.
It's very interesting Yeah, it's very
So
interesting.
yeah, if there's any other questions on the wildfire piece, I'm going to start kind of transitioning over to events that cause lots of precipitation. But if there's any other questions on the wildfire piece, happy to answer them now. Or if you want to just do that at the end, happy to do switch at that point and talk back more about wildfires then too. Then.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions for Phil, feel free to put them in the chat. You can always message him after. We'll have his email available, but you can message them in the chat right now and we'll be able to ask on live on the air.
Yeah, and obviously too, if questions come up on wildfire while I'm talking hurricanes, happy to go back and talk. One thing you do find how hurricanes and wildfires can be closely related is after a hurricane, obviously you have a lot of wind, a lot of rain, and the wind often will knock down a bunch of trees. And then if you happen to have drought after that, you have a bunch of basically great fuel that is ready available to burn. And for example, places like Western North Carolina, where we had catastrophic flooding, a tremendous amount of trees fall down. Right after that, we've been in pretty significant drought. And so there you can have heightened wildfire risk even after basically a catastrophic flooding event. So hurricanes can actually increase wildfire risk, for years down the road. And we've seen some pretty nasty wildfires in Florida in the year or two after Hurricane Michael, which went into the panhandle of Florida back in 2018. So while they're obviously very different phenomenon, and usually when you have a hurricane, you're not going to get a wildfire right afterwards, that can actually provide a fuel source for wildfires later on. So to kind of shift gears, I was going to start by talking a little bit about Hurricane Fiona, which was really the last kind of like classic hurricane extratropical cyclone to hit Canada. Obviously, as Blair mentioned, Hurricane Debbie, which hit the west coast of Florida, actually caused catastrophic flooding in parts of Ontario and Quebec. I believe Montreal set its all-time daily precipitation record. And I believe the records go back like 300 years. So setting a record when you've had 300 years of records is very, very, very impressive, but bad at the same time. So highlighting how storms may make landfall one place, and you think of west coast of Florida, probably not much of an impact for Canada, but these systems, even though they weaken and they may transition into other kind of more like what we call a mid-latitude cyclone, they still can have very significant impacts. And yes, Blair, I see your hand is raised.
And is that what, jumping ahead a bit here, Phil, but wasn't Fiona going to spin off to sea and then it came back as a tropical storm as it crossed over Nova Scotia and into Port aux Basques, Newfoundland?
Yeah, so Fiona was a system that took a long time to get going. It ramped up really quickly, became a very powerful hurricane kind of out east of near Bermuda. But then there were some models that were trying to take it out to sea, but unfortunately it kind of took pretty much a due north heading. And by the time it got to Canada, it looked quite a bit different from this. I'll show a satellite loop of it as it hit Canada. So its structure didn't look like a hurricane anymore. It didn't have a nice, well-defined eye, but it was an extremely powerful storm. And so we do a lot of work where we talk about, historically hurricanes have been categorized by wind. But overall, probably actually should be looking more at pressure, especially as you go up to Canada, because these storms will often spread out, so they get really big, but they may have very, very low pressures. And pressure is a big driver of the storm surge. And obviously, as we saw with Hurricane Fiona, had a tremendous storm surge associated with it. And so we get probably more confusion in the United States than you do in Canada, because you're used to these storms kind of transitioning from hurricane to non-tropical as they move north. But in the United States, there's a lot of confusion when these say you have a hurricane and then it transitions and is no longer a hurricane, but it may be just as strong. It's just the structure of the storm has changed. That can cause a lot of confusion. And especially the US, we had big issues with Sandy. So Hurricane Sandy was a big, powerful hurricane. And as it came towards New Jersey and New York, the structure of the storm changed. So it was no longer a hurricane, but it actually was getting stronger in terms of its intensity. It just was getting its energy instead of from just a warm ocean, it was getting it from frontal boundaries. And so the storm threat, if anything, was getting larger, but because the structure had changed, that caused some confusion. So again, I think Canada gets it a lot more because these storms are often transitioning and becoming non-tropical as they head towards Canada. But it's important to realize if the Hurricane Center says this storm is no longer tropical, it's extratropical or non-tropical, doesn't mean that the risks are reduced. They can actually be getting worse. And Fiona, I think, is actually a really good example of that. So I was going to show Fiona's track. So Fiona formed kind of in a classic area east of the Lesser Antilles, tracked northwestward across Dominican Republic. And then as it moved northward, it started to recurve towards the east, but then you can see it kind of bent back a little to the right and ended up hitting Nova Scotia. You will see that it went from purple, which is a major hurricane, to that black dashed line, which is a non-tropical or extratropical system. So again, the structure of the storm had changed. So it now had frontal boundaries. It was getting its energy source from these temperature differentials as opposed to just from the warm ocean. But it really hadn't weakened at all in terms of its intensity. It's just its structure had changed and obviously was a very powerful storm. So, here's just a few stats on Fiona. I think most notably, its pressure of 931 millibars or hectopascals was the lowest pressure recorded for a landfalling storm in Canada on record. And low pressure is associated with a strong storm because the reason we have winds in a hurricane is due to that pressure difference between the center of the storm and kind of what's going on out in the environment outside of the storm. So when that pressure in the center is very low, you tend to have very strong winds. And also, if the winds aren't super strong, it means the storm is really large in size. And large size storms are going to obviously have a large area of wind, a large area of rain, and also likely to have a much larger storm surge associated with them. And it doesn't require actually being a hurricane to have storm surge. These non-tropical cyclones can have significant storm surges with them. So this is a silent loop of Fiona as it's making landfall in Nova Scotia. So you can see, doesn't look like a hurricane anymore, right? It's got a very different structure. You can see kind of a well-defined frontal band on the eastern side going up into Newfoundland. And then you can see kind of the eye, or basically the center of the circulation, making landfall in far eastern Nova Scotia, about to going up into Cape Breton. And obviously, even though the structure had changed, it was still a very, very powerful storm, very low pressure. And obviously, we saw a lot of storm surge associated with Fiona. And then again, as I mentioned before, we had Debbie last year, which made landfall in the western part of Florida, but still caused significant impacts as a non-tropical cyclone in Ontario and Quebec. So I was going to shift gears now and talk about our outlook for the 2025 Atlantic hurricane season. So our group at Colorado State, we've been issuing seasonal forecasts since 1984, and these are for any storms forming anywhere in the North Atlantic Ocean. So these storms could form anywhere in the Atlantic Ocean, so anywhere from the west coast of Africa all the way to the Caribbean. And so we're forecasting an above normal season in 2025, a total of 17 named storms. Those are systems named by the National Hurricane Center, so winds of 39 miles per hour or greater. That's tropical storms and hurricanes. An average season has 14. Hurricanes, so we're forecasting 9. An average season has 7. Hurricanes are winds of 74 miles per hour or greater. Major hurricanes are category 3, 4, 5 hurricanes. Those are winds of 111 miles per hour or greater. And when we focus on these storms a lot as well, they only make up about a quarter of all the storms that form in a particular year. When you look at the damage that they cause, it's about 80 to 85% of the damage. So they are big drivers of the damage that we see. For example,
sorry, Phil. 39 miles per hour is about 63 kilometers per hour.
Sorry, sorry. I do everything in miles per hour in knots. Do you guys use knots up there?
It's okay. We do knots, but we're not meteorologists like you, my friend.
Okay, yeah. Most of the stuff we do is in knots, and it's interesting. I guess it's because so much of this stuff actually goes back to the hurricane system goes back to like the Beaufort scale, which was done by basically by a mariner, and effectively basically seeing how various wave characteristics and all these different structures would change. So a lot of it actually goes, most of what we do in meteorology is actually in knots, as opposed to miles per hour, kilometers per hour, even meters per second. And we also forecast accumulated cyclone energy, which, if you like geeky stuff, is basically a wind energy metric that accounts for storm frequency, intensity, and duration. So it weighs basically, if it's a storm's out there for a long time, it generates a lot of this ACE. And really why this matters is because if you think about it, if you have wind energy that's being expended over your house, and the wind's there for a long time, blowing and blowing and blowing, over time, it's going to find any weak spot in your house, and it's going to cause more and more damage. And so if we think about this as like a worst case scenario would be Hurricane Dorian in 2019, which basically stalled as a category 5 hurricane over Abaco in the Bahamas. So they basically had something like 12 to 18 hours of category 5 winds. So it's basically apocalyptic scenario. So that's why this ACE metric also matters. So all of our numbers are forecast to be above normal for 2025. And so a lot of the questions are, how do you do these seasonal forecasts? And so, this is my mentor, Dr. Bill Gray, looking into a crystal ball saying, verily, I see 17 named storms. And hey, that's our forecast. So this is exactly how we did the forecast this year. But actually, the way that we come up with these forecasts is using a lot of historical weather and climate data. Basically, what we look for are precursor signals. So we know which years in the past were busy seasons. We know which years in the past were quiet seasons. And then we basically look for what sets of conditions historically have preceded busy seasons. Alternatively, which sets preceded quiet seasons. And we find these recurring sets of basically precursor signals. So our philosophy can kind of be summarized by two statements from the legendary New York Yankees catcher, Yogi Berra. One is that it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. Certainly that's the case, right? Whether you're forecasting hurricanes, whether you're forecasting, political results, sporting results, all forecasting the future is extremely hard. But we do find that you can see a lot by looking. By going back into the past, we do find these precursor signals. And I'm going to try to convince you of that in this next slide. So Atlantic hurricane season's almost here. Starts June the 1st, but typically it doesn't really ramp up until August. So we get a lot of information during June and July because even though the season's officially started, most stuff doesn't occur till August. About 95% of your major hurricane activities occur after the 1st of August. If we look at June and July, and this is looking at ocean temperatures, for busy hurricane seasons minus quiet seasons, we see that busy seasons tend to have warmer water in the Atlantic. Makes sense since hurricanes live off of warm ocean water, so more of that warm ocean water creates conditions that are favorable for hurricanes. They have basically more fuel. But if you look in the Pacific Ocean, we also see a coherent set of basically a coherent spatial pattern of water temperatures, with cold water in the eastern and central tropical Pacific, warm water in the western tropical Pacific, and that's known as La Nina. La Nina is basically that pattern. El Nino is basically the opposite, warmer than normal water in that same region. And why we focus a lot on that for the Atlantic hurricane season is basically where water temperatures change in the Pacific Ocean, it changes the atmospheric circulation that then modifies conditions in the Atlantic Ocean. So again, El Nino is warmer than normal water in the eastern and central tropical Pacific. And why this matters is because of what it does to tropical thunderstorms in the Pacific Ocean. Pacific Ocean thunderstorms or thunderstorms anywhere in the ocean are going to want to form where waters are really hot. So in an El Nino, those waters are hot a little farther to the east, so those thunderstorms shift eastward in response with where those waters are the warmest. Whereas in La Nina, the water's super hot near Indonesia, the maritime continent, so those thunderstorms stay really far in the western part of the tropical Pacific. And why this matters for the Atlantic is because of how it changes the atmospheric circulation. So if we think about thunderstorms, we generally have what we call an in, up, and out circulation. So you have winds near the surface converging into those thunderstorms. The air goes up in the thunderstorms. You get those big cumulonimbus clouds. And then high up in the atmosphere gets stable, so the air has to spread out. So if we think about in an El Nino, you have those thunderstorms shift to the east. And if we look at the schematic, we see winds out of the east near the ocean surface in the tropical Atlantic, and winds out of the west higher up in the atmosphere. And why that matters is because that increases levels of what we call vertical wind shear. And so kind of when you think about shear, you think about basically things kind of pulling in opposite directions. That's what happens with the hurricanes. In an El Nino, your low-level winds become very strong out of the east. We call these trade winds that blow from east to west across the Atlantic. High up in the atmosphere, they blow out of the west. So you have this big, strong shearing that occurs, and that tends to tear apart hurricanes. It tilts the hurricane circulation, mixes in dry air. So that's good for us, bad for the hurricane. Whereas La Nina is basically the opposite. You have lower levels of shear, so that's good for the hurricanes, bad for us. So in general, when we have El Nino conditions, we have quieter seasons. La Nina tends to lead to busier hurricane seasons. Now, we use a lot of other predictors as well, but this just kind of gives you an idea of one of the big predictors that we use with our seasonal hurricane forecast. But El Nino and La Nina, while I focus a lot on hurricanes, does impact a lot of different things. So it impacts, this for example is La Nina and how it impacts weather patterns over North America. So in general, it tends to be wetter in Northern California, Oregon, up along into Washington and the western parts of British Columbia. across most of British Columbia and La Nina. You tend to have basically drier weather in the southern part of the United States, colder weather across some of the prairie provinces. But as you can see, even this past winter, even though we had a weak La Nina, this entire pattern didn't necessarily play out. Some of it did, some of it didn't. For example, in the US, it was wet in Oregon, but not particularly wet in Washington. And so this just highlights how these climate modes can impact the weather, but there's a lot of other stuff going on impacting weather as well, and especially as you get farther away from the tropical Pacific. Because obviously, if you think about it, right, Manitoba is a long way from Peru. So you're talking about where kind of the source region of where these forcing is coming from. There's a lot of other things going on to then impact kind of what the weather is that you actually get. But this just kind of gives you kind of a basic schematic of how weather typically is impacted by La Nina. El Nino often has somewhat of the opposite relationship, but not the exact opposite. There are some other factors that come in as well. So when it comes to seasonal forecasts, a lot of people say, how good are these forecasts? And so this is showing the seasonal hurricane forecast track record. So how well our correlations are between what we predict and what we observe each year. So higher correlations are better forecasts. So you can see that the blue columns are lower than the red columns. So the red columns are a recent year forecast. The forecast skill is improving. That's good news. We obviously want to be doing better at what we do. So the higher correlations indicate improved levels of skill. A couple of reasons for that. One is that the historical weather, which we build our models off of, the historical representations of the weather have gotten better. And that sounds kind of funny, like how do we know the past better now than we used to? But it's because we can take the observations that we had in the past and kind of fill in the gaps where we didn't have observations to get a more realistic view of what the past actually looked like, thanks to just better models, faster computers and better models. We also now have climate models that can forecast 3 to 6 months out. And here we're not looking at, say, a 6-month a forecast, say for, September 3rd. What we're looking at is a forecast for, say, a 1 or a 3-month average value. And especially in those tropics, those forecasts have shown considerable levels of skill. And that also helps with improving our seasonal forecast. So not to say that they're perfect and not to say that we won't have forecast busts, but in general, these forecasts have improved in recent years.
Hey, Phil, looks like you're on your way to getting perfect, though.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges that even if you can tell me perfectly, here's what the water temperatures look like, here's what the shear patterns look like for the August through October, the peak 3 months of the season, it doesn't give us. Hurricanes are weather events, and so you can have, say, an area where everything is conducive except for this one little area, and that'll be the area the hurricane tries to go to and it'll die. Or a lot of it in the US or the Atlantic too is there's land. So a storm may be in a very conducive environment, but it's too close to the coast and it'll die because when it gets over land, it loses its fuel source. And so we saw that even late last year. There was a system right off the north coast of Honduras that was in an extremely conducive environment, but it got too close to land and basically didn't amount to other than a weak tropical storm. Had it been 100 kilometers farther north, probably a major hurricane. But yes, we are hoping the forecast skill will continue to improve. And I think really one of our goals now is, with August forecast is generally pretty good, but is trying to get the August forecast skill maybe in July or June, and the June forecast skill in April, just because we now have, it's really not perfect. The model still can have massive busts, but in general, as we get better at kind of being able to predict these climate factors months in advance, that will help improve the skill of these forecasts. Yeah.
Hand up. So how accurate do you find these forecasts in the previous years that you've done them?
Yeah, so this is the correlations, which isn't not necessarily intuitive to know, like, okay, what's a correlation of 0.6 mean? But basically, I would say that on average, let's talk about hurricane number. Our August and June forecast is about plus or minus 2. So if you forecast 9 hurricanes, you're generally going to be between 7 and 11. So there's still uncertainty, but when you go to April, it's more about 3. It's been getting more closer to plus or minus 2 in recent years. Hopefully, we can continue to have that kind of skill in the future. Last year, for example, we forecast 11 hurricanes and 5 major hurricanes in April, and that's exactly what we had. So that's always really nice when you can get it right on the head. But there is going to be some years where you do bust. Sometimes because even though you think things are going to pan out a certain way, they don't. In other years, for example, you think you're going to get El Nino or you don't. But other years, there are times where you actually have things pan out exactly the way you expected to, but the storms just didn't play out the way that you thought. Either, they found the one pocket of conducive environment where everything else was non-conducive, or, there's other stuff that we can't necessarily, that isn't necessarily inherently predictable on these longer term timescales. I know we're already to about 12:48 Mountain Time, which some people say sounds like a fake time zone, right? Like Mountain Time, it sounds like what you do when you're on vacation. But I did want to talk a little bit about kind of what we're looking at and why we're forecasting a somewhat above normal season. So if we look at the tropical Pacific, that blue rectangle is the region that NOAA, or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, uses to monitor El Nino and La Nina. And you can eyeball it right now and say, yeah, it's kind of near average. So right now we have neutral conditions, which means neither El Nino nor La Nina. And that red rectangle denotes the Atlantic's main development region, so named because that's the region where hurricanes develop and intensify in the Atlantic. If we look at that region, we see water temperatures there are broadly running a little bit above normal at this point. So currently we have, again, these neutral conditions, so neither El Nino nor La Nina. We can look at model forecasts. And so if you want to get into the modeling of El Nino game, you're a little late to the party. So on the right-hand side, you have all these fun acronyms. I can't tell you what all those acronyms mean, but basically, all I want you to get out of this figure is that that black arrow denotes August through October. And you see almost all the lines are below El Nino. There's only one model, out of Beijing, China, that loves to forecast El Nino all the time. So it's continuing its forecast for El Nino. But all the other models, most of them are saying neutral conditions, maybe weak La Nina conditions. The NASA model, which is the coldest one, always likes to forecast La Nina. So we have a couple models here that I probably wouldn't pay a ton of attention to. But overall, looks like neutral is our best bet. And you can also look at what the actual official forecast is from NOAA again. So for August through October, they have a little bit over 50% chance of neutral conditions, about a 1 in 3 chance of La Nina, and about a 1 in 6 chance, or sorry, 1 in 8 chance of El Nino. So overall, we don't think we're going to have El Nino knocking down your storms by increasing your shear. That seems pretty unlikely at this point. The forecast skill of El Nino really ramps up about this time of year. During the spring, it can be really hard to forecast. But once you get to June, especially, the forecast skill does improve, obviously just because we're closer to the peak months of the season, again, August through October. If we look at the Atlantic main development region, we do see warmer than normal waters across most of the region. But there is some good news. We're not nearly as warm as last year at this time. You can see why last year people were pretty freaked out about the season. And it was a very busy season and played out very unusually in that we had a very busy start with the earliest Category 5 on record, Hurricane Beryl. But then we went through the peak 5 weeks of the season where normally we get a lot of storms. We had almost nothing. And then it finished with a very, very busy end with the most impactful hurricanes of the season, with Helene and Milton really causing a lot of damage in Florida and then up into the southeastern United States as well. So again, fortunately not as warm as last year at this time. We've had some pretty big changes in sea surface temperatures since January. So even in January, the water temperatures were running well above normal. But since January, you can see basically temperatures have cooled a lot relative to normal. So we were running really well above normal. Now we're just a little bit above normal. And the big reason for that is because we've had very strong winds blowing across the Atlantic. And across the tropical Atlantic, when the winds are blowing strongly, you get more evaporation. So kind of like if you're in a swimming pool and it's a windy day and you get out, you get cold in a hurry because you get all that evaporational cooling off your skin. Works the same in the ocean. When you have a strong winds blowing across an ocean, that's going to cause a lot of evaporational cooling. Unfortunately, those winds have tended to slacken a bit in recent weeks, so the water temperatures relative to normal have kind of stabilized. But again, fortunately not forecasting or not expecting to see an Atlantic as warm as last year, but still somewhat above normal. If we look at forecasts, this is from the North American Multi-Model Ensemble, or NMME. That model is forecasting, or that average of models is forecasting warmer than normal. So this is a few models from the United States and a couple from Canada. We use a variety of different techniques to come up with our forecast. One is purely using historical data. So the forecast came out the 1st of early April. So we use data up through the end of March. And so these three predictors in combination work pretty well at explaining hurricane activity going back to about the late 1970s, which is when we start to have pretty good reliable data. So here the blue line is the observed value. The red line is what we call our hindcast value. So how we use these predictors in those years, how well would they have forecast? And you can see in general, the match is pretty good. You do see a pretty big spread last year, right? Though, you know, the observed value was still very high, but not as high as the model was forecasting. There was a really pronounced lull during the peak of the season last year. We had 5 weeks again during the peak of the season where normally things really ramp up, but last year was very, very quiet. And we actually just submitted a paper on the lull, some of the drivers of that, and happy to talk about that at the end of this presentation if anyone is interested, besides me, who finds that stuff fascinating. And so a lot of times people say, you know, well, okay, what can we do with this? And obviously we always stress it only takes one. You know, you can have a gnarly hurricane in a quiet season that causes a ton of damage. Alternatively, you can have a busy season and you get lucky. But here what we're looking at is damage. This is for the continental US. For the 10 years where a model forecasts the most activity, the 10 years where the model forecasts the least activity. And you can see that while there is some overlap, there's a lot more damage in general in the busy seasons. And again, that makes sense because effectively you're throwing a heck of a lot of darts at a board, and you can get lucky and not have storms make landfall in a busy season. But overall, if you say look at 10 busy seasons, you're likely to have a lot more landfalls than in the 10 quiet seasons. And obviously, if storms are making landfall, they're likely to cause damage. So again, you can find outliers, but in general, the busier seasons are likely to have more landfalls and cause more damage. We also use what we call a statistical dynamical model. And basically what this is we look at various forecasts from different groups. So for example, the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasts, a forecast from the UK Met Office, one out of Japan, one out of Italy. And what we're looking at is forecasts for, in this case, they only go out 6 months. So they go out through August for the April forecast. And so we're looking at forecasts of sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic and in the Pacific. So as you may remember from what we talked about earlier, the Atlantic is warm and the Pacific is cold. That tends to lead to a busier hurricane season. So we look at the forecast from those different models to give us kind of a sanity check from what we get from just our statistical model. Now, we do know these forecasts aren't perfect. We talked somewhat about that, but we provide a range in our forecast document. Now, the top line number that we give is the actual forecast, or sort of the best estimate. And the reason we do that as opposed to providing the range kind of in our media outlook is because if you provide a range, the media will often say, okay, you're forecasting 7 to 12, you're forecasting up to 12. So oftentimes the public interprets your range as basically your best forecast being the high end of your range. Whereas if you say we're forecasting 9 hurricanes, they report, hey, they're forecasting 9 hurricanes. So I think it helps kind of clear up some of the confusion that can arise if you report a range. And obviously these ranges are large, right? I mean, you know, 2 to 6 major hurricanes, that's a lot of seasons that have that. And that just highlights the uncertainty that we have at this long-term lead time. Those uncertainty ranges do shrink as we put out our next updates because we're closer to the events we're trying to predict, and those forecasts generally have higher levels of skill. In addition to forecasting kind of basin-wide activity, we do provide probabilities of being impacted by hurricanes and tropical storms. And so here's an example looking at Nova Scotia. And so the way that we do these impacts is we calculate all the storms that track within 50 miles of each county in the US, as well as province, state, islands in the Caribbean, various countries. And the reason we use a 50-mile buffer as opposed to requiring landfall is because, you know, a storm doesn't have to track directly over your county, your country, your state, your province to cause significant impacts. Certainly if there's a storm 50 miles or about 80 kilometers away, that's going to cause significant impacts. And especially when you think about Canada, these storms in general grow in size, so they get really large. So you can have a storm that may have officially be 100 miles away, but still causing very significant impacts. So the way that we calculate these probabilities is based on historical data, and then we adjust them based on our latest forecast. So this year, because we're forecasting an above normal season, the probabilities are elevated for Canada, as well as for other areas in the United States, Central America, and the Caribbean. Our forecasts aren't stagnant. We'll put out an update on the 11th of June, an additional update on the 9th of July, and a final update on the 6th of August. One thing I like to say is that with the 6th of August forecast, we start doing 2-week predictions. And the reason we do 2-week forecasts is because, you know, you can have a busy season that has quiet periods like last year where we had a very quiet middle of the season. Alternatively, you can have quiet seasons that have very busy periods. And when you start looking at 2 weeks as opposed to 3 to 6 months, you can start to go from, okay, it looks like a busy season to, hey, the next 2 weeks look busy, and we anticipate storm formation, say in the Western Atlantic, we're likely to impact life and property, or hey, it looks busy, but everything should stay out in the open ocean and just be a hazard to mariners. So that's where we can start to kind of really get more into direct impacts for United States, Canada, Caribbean, Central America. In the last 1 minute, I did want to briefly touch on our seasonal hurricane predictions platform, which is hosted by the Barcelona Supercomputing Center. And so on this website, we have seasonal forecasts from a pile of different groups. There's about 25 different groups now doing seasonal hurricane forecasts. There's other universities, there's private sector weather companies, as well as government agencies such as the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which just put out their seasonal hurricane forecast last week. So if we go to the website, you can see the visualization is displayed below. So the red dot on the y-axis is the observed value to date. So far, no hurricanes. Let's keep that going as long as possible. The orange dot represents the average of all the different groups. So you take all the different forecasts, average them together. The average is 8. As you remember, our forecast is 9. And then you see the different forecasts from the different groups. So here, blues are government agencies, greens are universities, and purples are weather companies and private sector forecast groups. So certainly invite you to check that website out if you're interested in seasonal forecasts. The website is updated in near real time as the groups submit their forecasts. They will be updated. So invite you to check that out. There's a lot of groups putting out forecasts. I was just counting as I go. I think we have 22 different groups that have so far submitted seasonal forecasts. So there's been a lot of different agencies. It was only CSU from 1984 till 1997, but since then, there's a lot of different other groups getting into the seasonal forecasting game. And so with that, I always like to finish with an admonition from Arago, who was the head of the Paris Observatory in the middle of the 19th century. And I think certainly this is still very prescient today, and that is never, no matter what may be the progress of science, will honest scientific men or women who have regard for their reputations venture to predict the weather. And so with that, I will put up my contact information, and I will happily take any remaining questions.
So, Phil, does that mean that every weather forecast that comes on at night, that should flash up in front of the screen?
Oh, for sure. Definitely.
Okay. All right.
No, that was incredible, Phil. Wow, I feel like I just learned so much, and I need to have a one-on-one with you now because that was so much information just thrown at me, and I know you have so much more information to share. We do have 2 questions here, but I just want to thank you first for all of your insight. So thank you so much, Phil. One of the questions we have here says, is there a level of AI used in today's forecasting at all?
Yes, so there's more and more of that being used. And so like on our seasonal forecast right now, we don't implicitly use it with the outlook. And part of the reason is because for hurricane seasons, we only have 50, 60 years of good data. So AI is awesome when you have millions upon millions of data points. So if you go to like Google and type a search in, the reason they're so good is because you have billions of queries. Whereas when you only have 60 years, that doesn't give you a ton of information. But one thing that where we're starting to use it more in is, as I talked in our forecast, we use these, what would I call these, statistical dynamical models, which are using basically forecasts of the climate system. Those are incorporating more and more of the kind of AI approaches. So I'm not necessarily convinced that our group is necessarily going to use, we're going to use one AI model and that's going to be our answer. But I think those are definitely going to become more and more kind of one of our suite of products is using some more of those kind of AI climate models to forecast. And even if you look at day-to-day hurricane predictions or even just day-to-day weather predictions, some of these AI models are getting quite good and are adding some useful skill to what we already have. And to me, it's kind of interesting. So normally, if we think about how we forecast the weather, we take all the observations that we have, whether they be satellite, weather stations, however, buoys, boats, whatever. We take them all that, we put them on a grid, and we run that forward in time, and we say, okay, here's the equations that govern the atmosphere, ocean, go. A dynamical or an AI model basically say, we're going to give you we're going to tell you what the answer is, and you figure out the equations from the answers. So kind of the opposite of the way that you would learn, say, like math in school. They're going to tell you, here's the formula, and then you figure out the answer. It'd be like learning it the opposite way. But for AI models, that works quite well. And one of the things that AI models do is they will try to kind of, they'll kind of learn the equations, but they also may kind of combine complexities that may or may not be physical, but in general, they actually have shown comparable skill to some of the top of the line dynamical models that we run. So I think there's a lot of excitement that could be coming down the pike with AI for forecasting, just for hurricanes, but just weather in general.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. Just one more question for Dr. Phil and Blair here. Somebody else asked, how is climate change taken into account in the future forecasts?
Yeah, so climate change, we could do a whole other seminar on climate change and weather or climate change and hurricanes. But one of the things that we do a lot of is, so when it comes to climate change and how it impacts basically just weather and especially hurricanes, is it's kind of which areas are warming faster. So for example, in recent years, while the Atlantic has generally, like the globe is warming, but the Atlantic has generally been warming faster than, say, the Pacific Ocean. And so where the waters are the warmest is going to be kind of where your thunderstorms are going to want to develop. And basically where the thunderstorms are going, you're going to get more air going up, which is good for hurricanes, bad for people. And so in general, the Atlantic is quote unquote winning in recent years. And so so basically the Atlantic in general has been busy, but the Pacific Ocean, so where we get our typhoons, has been actually much quieter than normal. Their activity there has gone down by about 30% since 1990. Some of that due to a long-term trend towards La Nina. So as we talked about earlier, La Nina reduces the shear in the Atlantic and is good for Atlantic hurricanes. It's bad for Pacific storms. It tends to actually suppress activity there. And so this long-term trend towards La Nina is a big driver of what we've seen both in the Atlantic, but also globally with storm activity. So as long as this trend continues, probably the Atlantic will continue to be quite robust. But I can tell you, working with a fair number of colleagues over in Asia, they're asking, where are our storms? We just haven't had the storms. And a lot of that, again, is due to this long-term trend towards La Nina.
Very interesting. Well, yeah. I think those are all our questions that we have here today. So I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in. I'd like to give a very big thank you to Dr. Phil Klotzbach and to Blair Earl here, my friend, to provide their insights here on this exciting webinar. And if anyone wants to reach out, Dr. Phil provided his contact information. Blair has his contact information. You guys all know it. And if you can't find it, just reach out to me, allison@mediamatters.ca, and I will send it to you guys. But thank you both for being here today. It was really, really interesting. I really thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
And thank everybody for joining, for taking the time to listen to this. And I get an education every time Dr. Phil takes me through it. So it's valuable stuff as we move forward, have more reoccurring events in Canada. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Be good.
Thank you. And
Bye-bye.
Dr. Phil, we're going to have you back on another one because we want more of this for sure.
All right. Sounds good. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night or day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.